LHC Unplugged. I'm Sarah Harrington. I'm the Director of Communications here at LongHillChapel, and I have our lead pastor, Michael Hoddy, and our associate pastor, Joey Monteleone. Oh, I almost messed up your name there. Sorry about that.
There have been worse iterations of my name. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, guys.
Hi, Sarah. Do you know what Monteleone means?
No, but we did a podcast and we talked about this.
Did we?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's important to come back and remind.
I don't remember what it was, though.
It means mountain lion.
Mountain lion.
Yep.
It's Italian for mountain lion. So,
and a lot of people confuse it for French. I won't try to do.
Do people? We talked about the last syllable thing, but
Yeah.
What I want to talk about is like, how would it be if we did a podcast with an actual mountain lion
Just sitting in the corner.
making roaring noises?
Every once in a while you hear a purr.
Yeah,
That's uncomfortable.
I might listen to it. I wouldn't want to do that podcast, but I might listen to it.
That would freak me. I listen to most podcasts with my earbuds. Are they earbuds?
AirPods?
AirPods. Earbud is an earbud. AirPods with my headphones.
Did you know that the dog in Air Bud is the same dog that was in Full House?
Did not know that.
Now you do.
That's wild.
That's great information.
So
all of
we
that to say.
we started the podcast, and within 10 seconds, we went careening off into the woods.
It's gone.
So Sarah, what are we
I
doing
was going to
here?
say we should do the mountain lion heading into VBS because that would be a good way
yeah.
to tie in the rainforest and all that.
and all of
But
that.
there's no mountain lions in rainforest, Sarah.
There's
Maybe
not,
we'll have one
and
that show.
apparently most mountain lions are not actually mountain lions. They're mislabeled as leopards. Mountain lions are actually pretty rare.
So how did you come across this information?
I Googled it.
What prompted you to Google it?
My daughter.
Oh, okay.
Because, explaining
I'm
this,
just-
she's like, all right, let's do a report.
I'm just imagining you sitting there thinking, you're like, you know what? What about mountain lions?
Or at the dinner table, just sitting the kids down. All right, guys, let's do this. You need to understand where we are in the circle of life.
Yes. Misidentified Leopards is not a very good band name, but it could be a band name.
That's a starting track on a really bad album.
Yes.
So guys,
Sarah.
Father's Day.
Yeah.
It's coming up. Speaking of children and having dinners, we weren't really, but we're going to tie it in there.
Yeah. How's this working for you?
How do you guys feel about Father's Day coming up? I will give you the floor to do your best dad jokes right now.
Are you sure you want to give us the floor after what just happened where we managed to work in mountain lions, Italian, Air Bud?
I'll connect it to my dad joke.
Okay, go for it.
Where do cats learn how to swim? In the kiddie pool.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, that's the worst. And cats mostly hate water, just so we're clear.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kitty. That's called doubling down.
Yeah, so what I do with dad jokes is I'll put it out there and usually no one will respond to
Nobody
it. So I
bites.
do the double down, which is like
yeah.
the dad thing where you have to kind of do it again and maybe explain it a little bit. The moment you have to explain the dad joke, it's like it's over.
Yeah.
But that's what I do with them.
That
So,
means unpacking it a little bit further, right?
yeah, which is one of your favorite words.
Sarah, every joke is a dad joke if a dad is the one that tells it.
That is true. Do your kids call it out, though?
No.
Are they like, oh, that's such a dad joke?
They don't get most of them.
Yeah. I'm trying to teach my older son like the nuance of humor. Yeah, seriously though, to make this a little more serious, this is my favorite part of my life is my boys and getting to do that, and also it's the most daunting part because you see a reflection of yourself. You see all the places. There's nothing that kind of tests your character like being a parent, I think, and especially being a dad in an age where there's a lack of good father figures and they're either not there or they're not healthy. They're not helpful. That's something that I see as a high calling, a constant struggle, and really something that matters a lot. The day, it's great, but it's mainly we get to go to brunch, and I like brunch. I've never say no to brunch, but yeah, it's complicated, I think, like any of those days, because you, as a dad myself, you see the things you aspire to. You look at these boys who are looking to you, and so much of their reality will be shaped by you. Mm-hmm. You look at the ups and the downs of your own dad, and I certainly do that. It's a very, it's nuanced. There's so much good and there's some challenges too. I think you look at God too. I think God kind of shapes our view of fathers and fatherhood. And very often, not to get too deep into this, but how we see God is how we saw our dads. Again, the positive things and the negative things. So it's a nuanced Sunday. There's brunch, there's dad jokes, and then there's a lot of deeper stuff too.
But you did say something that it is a calling.
Yeah.
And God does call us to many different things. And sometimes there's the uncertainty heading into it.
Yeah.
Like with you guys, when you found out you're going to be dads, what was that moment like?
I know exactly where I was. We were living in an apartment on Route 22, and the entire day had gone by. She had a doctor's appointment, and I just said, hey, was everything okay? She goes, yeah, no problem. Okay, moved on with her day. And then we went back to her mom's house and we had dinner. She never said anything. And we had a 15-minute drive home in the car, never said anything. We got into the apartment. I closed the door. She turned around and looked at me and said, I'm pregnant. Oh. And I just was like, welling up in tears. It wasn't even on my radar that we might have been. But the beam of her face, the excitement, the fact that she held it all day. And to me, it was beautiful because it was something that she got to process for her for as long as she wanted until she told the very next person. And that was me. So, yeah, I'll never forget that. But, every single time we have 5 at home.
Is that how many there are now?
There are 5. Yep. Every single time it's been unique. It's been different, but they've all been special. The hopes and the dreams that come out of that announcement, the reality, the fear that sets in of like, okay, there's another life to shape. But there's kind of a gap between your knowledge of the situation and then how God has equipped you. And hopefully every day that you show up to those, that gap gets a little bit smaller.
And what was it like for you, Pastor Michael, when you
found
out?
It was... I mean, again, it's got a lot of depth to it. We were parents later in our lives, and actually after a period of real struggle in our marriage, both of us came from broken homes, and we brought our broken home patterns into our relationship with each other, regardless of, we declared we would never do that, but you don't do what you aspire to, you do what you know, right. You do what you've seen, and we did that, and I think God, by his grace, and I mean this 100%, he gave us another shot. And us having our boys was the culmination of that. And there's really not a day that I don't go by that I look at them and I'm not reminded of the grace of God in very different ways. This is so typical of my wife, Grace. She'd gotten up, had to go to work early or something, and I was still sort of asleep. She comes in, she puts a pregnancy test down on the nightstand, and she says, I'm pregnant. And she was like, left or something like that. And
heads up.
But it had been, that had been a journey for us. And I mean, it was one of those things that I think early in my adult life and in our marriage, I was a little fearful of, and I couldn't even tell you why. Maybe it was some of my own experiences, but after that whole season, we were ready. This is what we wanted together. It was a joy. And what I did for both my boys is I have pictures on my phone I took a picture, just a selfie, as I was waiting outside the delivery room. It reminds me of those moments. I remember for my older son, Christopher, I just knew that was a line between everything that was before and everything that would be after. And it has been. And it's a very different life, and I think a richer one. My younger son, Jonathan, came in the middle of COVID and came after, we had experienced a couple miscarriages and gotten to the point where we were wondering if we'd ever have that chance. And to make a longer story short, it was one of those things. He came very early. He was premature, and we were not ready for that at all. And I just remember saying to God, I don't know what this journey is going to look like, but I'm going to receive whatever this is, whatever complications he has as a blessing from you. And I trust that you'll give us the grace to live that every day. And there were some times where we really thought that he was going to have significant challenges medically for his whole life. And God just kind of did miracle after miracle. Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
And, I never forget where I was when the last of the big medical challenges, we'd had a couple tests, and it looked like, he's going to be stuck with a condition for his entire life. I'd begun to accept that, and they did one more shot. And it came back absolutely clear.
And he is just a thriving 5-year-old now, just running around the church, tearing it up.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. I look at him and, I think we all struggle to see the faithfulness of God, maybe in the way that we want to or that we expect to. And it's just like I have this daily reminder, and it's just such a gift to me for God to say, see what I can do through a lot of uncertainty. But it really is. It's the best part of my life. Not the easiest, but the best.
Yes, that's true. And you talked about how there was a little bit of a gap in between your 2 sons. And we also personally went through infertility challenges to have our first and second. And there was this point where I was like, God, I know you're calling to be a mom, but where are you here? You
Yeah.
know, like this
Yes.
isn't, and I'm in this pattern, and we're faithful people, my husband and I, but there was just this uncertainty. Talk a little bit about that gap. What do we do in that? Why do we feel the way we do when we're in that, even though we have the faith we do in God?
Yeah, so this is something we've begun talking about here at Long Hill, and we're going to do that for the next few weeks. But I think using this picture we've painted, there's the thing where we feel the big call of God, like, let's have kids, or let's get married, or let's, set out on this new adventure. And that's kind of when the music swells and the sun rises, and it's just this big moment. And there might be some uncertainty. There might be some steps of faith. Actually, there almost always are steps of faith. But they're the kind of thing, because we have this picture of the end and this vision of what it's going to look like, we're usually able to take those. Not that they're easy, but we're able to take those steps and take a step into a new season or into an unknown or something like that. The challenge is there's this big space between that and us actually seeing the end, seeing the payoff, seeing the result, seeing the next stop on the journey. And that's, I think, where a lot of people get stuck. They get lost because we expect there to be just this consistent path between that first call of God and us seeing the next result. And there's the gap in between. And sometimes it feels like a chasm. It feels like a canyon. It's something where we don't know how we're going to get from here to there. And I think for people who follow Jesus, we have faith in God. It's not like we lack faith. I think there's some condemnation that we kind of inflict on ourselves sometimes when we run into the gap, because we think we didn't have enough faith, or we didn't believe right, or we didn't see or hear right. And this is part of the journey of faith, is the gap. So we have faith in God, but we just are faced with these things, and they really cause us a lot of discomfort, because there's this gap between God's call, between that step of faith, and us actually seeing the results, seeing why it mattered, seeing that it was worth it. And sometimes even that thing, the vision we had for the end, what actually is the end, what actually God is doing, is different than we expected.
So when we're in that gap, how do we know what to do in it? How do we know when to take that step?
This brings up a human nature thing, I think. This brings up a tendency that we have to understand that there's a couple different versions of, because in our faith, in Christianity, there's this whole thing, you need to step out in faith. You need to step out in faith. And yeah, we do need to step out in faith. But the thing that I think happens is there's actually two groups of people who have two different kind of default reactions. I'm generalizing a lot with this, but there are people who are jump aheaders, and there's people who are waiters. And the challenge with both of those is those can be a reaction or desire to kind of stay in control and stay in certainty that we can spiritualize. So there's some people that when they're faced with that discontinuity, with that gap in their lives, they're like, you know what, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to take the step of faith. I'm going to jump over the chasm because I want to get back into certainty as much as possible. And it's easy to say, well, I'm just stepping out in faith. And it's like, no, you're actually trying to step back into control. And there's another group of people who, it's interesting being in ministry and working with people and serving people who are just like, I need to go pray about it. And yeah, you should go pray about it. I'm just waiting on the Lord. I'm just waiting on the Lord. I'm like, yeah, you need to wait on the Lord, but you also need to get up and move, because we see both of those things throughout the Bible. We see God calling people to wait on him and God calling people to step out in faith. And I think what I've observed is that most people fit into one of those two groups, where their default will either be waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, because waiting is certain. The place is certain. You don't have to go anywhere. And you can spiritualize staying where you are. And then there's the group who's like, I'm going to step out in faith and jump across the canyon and do that. And that, again, you can spiritualize it, but that's actually an attempt to get back into control. And so what actually I think begins to happen is we need to maybe figure out which one of those camps we fall into each, and then challenge ourselves with the opposite response. It's not to do no waiting, and it's not to do no jumping, but it's just to slow down and consider that maybe if we're stuck on the waiting side, that God's calling us to take the step. And if we're trying to take the step, maybe God's calling us to wait.
Definitions are really important. I think a lot of people misassociate faith with expectation, and they misassociate faith with timing. And so we hear a call from God and we say, okay, here's how it's going to look.
Yeah.
That's unrealistic. unfortunately, but it is where we trip ourselves up because we have a vision of what we think these things are going to look like. And so if they don't happen, now we think there's something wrong with our faith.
Yes.
And then we think there's something wrong that either we misheard it, like you were saying, Pastor Michael, because things aren't happening on our timetable. I think of the series that we're in where Abraham was given a promise and then nothing happens for a really long time, despite trying to be faithful. Now, are the two necessarily connected? Not really. Faith in God's promise has nothing to do with his timing, but if we associate one with the other, we will trip ourselves up. The same thing happens throughout the narrative of Scripture. I mean, back in the book of Genesis, when the promise of the ultimate defeat of evil happens, I imagine Adam and Eve were waiting around for weeks going, when's it coming? When's it coming? And, we get hung up on the slightest thing that doesn't happen in our timetable. Imagine the people of Scripture waiting for the Messiah. They had to do it for a really long time. And one of the verses that come to mind is in the New Testament book of Hebrews, where it says, faith is the evidence of things not seen. And there's this aspect to faith where if you're going to actually have authentic faith, the biblical definition of faith, you will not see it. You will not see all the expectation you have. You will not see it in your time, but that doesn't mean it's not faith. Just because you can't comprehend, see, understand all of that, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your faith. And I really want to stress that for our listeners, that the condemnation you were talking about, to just beat ourselves up because maybe we heard it wrong, or I'm not seeing it happen, I must not be as spiritual as I think I am. No, the two aren't connected. And I think it's a beautiful tactic of the enemy to just disillusion us with the spiritual discipline of faith, where Scripture, on the other hand, says you're not going to see these things the way that you think they're going to manifest, but that doesn't mean God's not at work. And so we have to release ourselves from that condemnation, the self-condemnation, and quite frankly, the condemnation that we hear within culture, that if you didn't make it happen or it's not happening for you, well, then just try harder, or perhaps you misunderstood, or reframe it. Like, no, there's a call to diligence. There's a call to faithfulness, but that faith is often outside of our control.
And it's interesting, you mentioned Hebrews chapter 11. That first couple verses is one of the more known parts of the book of Hebrews, which is kind of a complicated book. And later on in chapter 11, the writer lists what, in kind of theological terms, we call the Faith Hall of Fame. It's all these people like Abraham and Moses and kind of all the big characters that you would hear in Sunday school and in Bible stories. And then at the end, he says, and they all died.
Oh,
basically.
nuts.
They were waiting for the promise and they didn't get to see it, but they looked ahead. They looked expectantly for its coming. I think that gives us a different definition of faith, because we think of faith as something you need between the call and the payoff, the response or the fulfillment. And sometimes it's just sitting in the call. It's sitting there and maybe never seen, at least in the way that you want, definitely not in the timing you want, maybe not even in your lifetime, the response and the payoff. And I know we talked about fatherhood and parenthood. There's people, maybe you're listening to this podcast, people who have tried to be faithful parents and it just hasn't. You don't see the payoff. You're not like, I've raised my kids up in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and they're great Christians and doing great things. I have friends who have done their very best, and it seems like their kids they're kind of off the map. And I know, and I've talked to some of them about just the holding on to hope and how hard it is for them. And I always say, God's got a longer view of this than you do, but I just can't imagine what that must feel like, knowing the things I feel about my children and still not seeing how that story ends. If, there's that long middle where it seems like things are in doubt. It's kind of your standard 3-act play. And you don't see the third act. You don't see the resolution of the conflict. And that really is the hardest kind of faith. The faith between taking the step and seeing the result. And I think when we're able to look back, a lot of the things in the middle make a lot more sense. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the looking back is not even something we get to do in our lives. It's after that. That just comes with a ton of trust, a ton of deep trust and struggle.
Well, and building off of that, slightly tangential, but going back, I think, is really important so that you remember the faith you had at the beginning. The Old Testament has been really rich for us lately here at LongHillChapel, and Moses goes back and says, remember when you did this, remember when you did this, and he calls the people to remember too. There's something about going back to the onset of our faith when you're in the trench of it that actually helps you navigate through it, because we are tired, we are exhausted, we don't see it. We feel like we've been faithful all this time and we're not seeing results. You kind of have to go back and remember what God said at the beginning, because if we do believe that he's faithful, then we have to trust the initial call. Let's say it's parenting. Nothing will ever beat the moment I first held my oldest. Nothing. I have to remember that when my youngest is screaming. And that will carry me through, because now I remember the beauty of the moment. And I think the same thing happens with faith. We get tired, we get disillusioned, we look around and, the culture's going crazy and we don't really know what to believe. Everything's artificial. It's really overwhelming. And it's easy to just kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, like, oh, I guess I don't have any faith. No, you got to remember what God called you to. And I think there's a beauty of that nature of faith where you can go back at the beginning and say, this is actually going to help me get around this struggle that I'm having right now. Not many things afford you that, but faith does.
I think what God does, and I think he's actually very faithful to do this, it kind of relates to the story I shared, is he gives us just enough light to see and to continue to trust him. He gives us just enough evidence that we can go hold on to in the past when we look back, when we're facing the uncertainty of the present and the future. And, like with my kids, and I told you about my younger son and that journey, we had come through a hard time in our relationship. We'd had our first son, and we're just so thankful for him. And then there was this really difficult period of wanting more children, and in some ways feeling like, man, maybe we ran the clock out too much with our own issues as a married couple. And wanting that second child and having the miscarriages and having the waiting and having the uncertainty. And I remember when Grace was pregnant with my younger son, it just was so different. It seemed so certain and it seemed so strong. And then there was that moment where it was basically a medical emergency and we ended up in the hospital in the middle of COVID. And, as a pastor, I should be less cynical and more faithful. But I was just like, I threw up my hands kind of inside. I'm like, of course, this is what it's going to be. Of course, we're going to end up in a different version of the same place. And then through that whole journey of premature birth and potential medical complications, I was still there. On one side, I was saying, God, give me just enough grace to live this out. But on the other side, I was asking a lot of questions and struggling. And when God did what he has done, that story is, I think for everybody, and we have to be so careful to remember these things. There's these tentpole stories in our life where we've seen the faithfulness of God. And I think we all have them, and maybe we've missed them, and maybe we've forgotten them just because of whatever the current circumstances are. But it is so important for us to hang on to those, to remind ourselves, to remind each other of the truth of that, because it does give us enough of a hold, enough of a handhold as we face the uncertain present and the uncertain future to realize that God actually is still faithful. He has been faithful in the past, and he'll be faithful in the present.
It's interesting when I want to say discovered God for the first time, because it really was as an adult. And I really started to see God's grace. And I remember people saying, well, you gotta listen to God. You gotta listen. He's going to let you know. And I remember sitting in my head, listening for a voice. Now, this sounds probably crazy to you guys, but coming into it, I was just listening. I'm like, okay, I don't hear God there. And nope, God's not talking there. And then I learned it started to be what my gut feeling was God talking to me. But I was expecting to hear this voice like out of the clouds, like in the movies, you know.
Would that be great? Then you know.
And then I would know, right? Then there's like none of that uncertainty. How do we know when it's a call from God?
There's a couple things, and I think first, kind of back to what I said too, we have an expectation of what it's going to be. Like the clouds roll back and you hear a voice and, thus saith the Lord, and that would be great. Sometimes it happens. I can tentpole moment times where I very clearly heard from God. I can also point to the fact that my wife tells me things a lot, and it's the voice of God. Not that she's God, but God speaks through others around you. And then I can say with certainty that some of the most profound things in the last couple days have been through Instagram Reels. And they've shown up in kids' temper tantrums, but they've also shown up by washing dishes. I serve a really big God, and he's not limited to one way of communicating, but he does affirm and confirm what he's trying to get across to me in a myriad of ways. I don't think it's necessarily, I think for a lot of us, maybe this is a broad brushstroke, but I don't think for a lot of us, there's this one and done instance of a call. I think there are things that show up that maybe God is inviting you to if you have eyes to see, which I love your story where you just stopped and you said, I'm going to listen. Now, did you hear it the way you thought you were going to? Not necessarily, but over time, can you look back and say there was a repetition of God inviting me into a deeper relationship?
100%.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a purity with you wanting to stop and wanting to hear. And I think that's actually a tremendously important starting place, because what a lot of us, I won't even say a lot of other people, we all want to do is we've kind of already decided what we want and we're just looking for affirmation. And so it's easy to assign the voice of God to whatever affirms the thing we've already decided we want. I have found that God very often, it's not that he's the opposite of that, but that his call and his voice forces us to lay down the things we want the most. And what happens very often is he gives them back to us. The scriptures say that, the Lord gives us the desires of our heart. And it's easy to say, well, I want a new car and I want a bigger house. And so God, give me the new car and the bigger house. And there's a whole pile of bad theology that's been built on that. But I think it's important to start with the fact that the desires God has placed in your heart are actually good desires.
Yeah.
They can be fulfilled in wrong or bad or improper or unhelpful or unhealthy ways, but they're good things. And getting back to that is an important thing, but then laying that down before the Lord, I think as an act of worship, is the key. It's saying, God, you've given me this thing, but I release my grip on what I think it should look like. Even though I have a very clear idea of what I think it should look like, I release my grip on that. And there's usually a period of waiting. And it's not that we just do that like as a perfunctory thing so God will give us the thing that we want in the end, but he remakes those in a way and he gives them back to us.
Can I give you an example of it?
Sure.
That involves you?
Oh boy.
Yeah. Young Joey, who thought he was going to go be Jason Mraz for Jesus.
Blonde tips.
Blonde tips in his hair. Yep. Sarah really likes that.
I loved that.
I wanted a music career so bad, and I was doing everything I could to get it. And I remember after a very significant moment of disappointment, I had a conversation with God on the way home from a concert. And I remember very clearly him saying, I'll give you the desires of your heart. I was reading through scripture. And I said, but this is the desire of my heart. And he said, go deeper. And I said, well, then it's this. He said, no, go deeper. And it was probably about a half an hour going back and forth with God about what the real desire of my heart was. And when I got to the bottom of it, I felt him very similar to what Pastor Michael was saying, say, okay, then lay it down. Then lay everything else down. And so I did. I was done with music. I was not going to pursue this. And I had one more show to do. And I was just kind of doing it out of obligation, but it was fine. I showed up. It was kind of this art collective of random artistic expression.
Random artistic people.
Yeah, but I was the acoustic guitar player at the time in the mid-aughts, and, it kind of fit the bill. And I just did my show. I just did my music, and it was the last one, whatever. All right, whatever God's going to do, because I'm laying this down. And there was another musician who was there, and they had a piano player, and the piano player comes up to me afterwards and says, you're really good. I said, oh, thank you. He goes, have you ever considered leading worship? And I said, no. He said, well, here's my card. My church is just up the street. Give me a call. And that's when I met Pastor Michael. And I had no idea what that was going to mean, not for music, but for the trajectory of my life. And you just don't know. Right. But that requires two things. And I think, as we're all getting steamy-eyed in here, that requires two things. One, you have to be willing to lay it down if God asks you to, because he's got something so much better. He just does. But the other thing, too, is that we get to be a part of that redemptive story for other people. If Michael had not decided, I'm going to look beyond myself, Joey does not exist the way that I do right now. I don't have the career trajectory. I don't have the family legacy that I get to pour into my children. Our church does not get the dynamic of the two of us. It just doesn't happen if Michael doesn't say yes in that moment. Some of that's just being eternally grateful for you and our relationship, but you made a choice. And we all have the ability to do that. we all have the ability to be what God uses for somebody else. But if we've got this small view of what God wants to do because of our expectations, our timings, our insecurities, our desire for control, we miss it. Now, does that mean God can't do anything? No, of course not. But we get to be a part of it. He brings us in and gets delight out of partnering with his people. I mean, like, what more can we ask for?
Well, thanks so much for listening to LHC Unplugged. As a reminder, we gather on Sundays at 10:15, both in person on Shumpike Road in Chatham, New Jersey, and online at lhcnj.net. And if you have a question for our pastors to answer, please send it in to us. And you can do that by emailing it to us at questions@lhcnj.net. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to having you next time.